Masechet Baba Batra Daf Mem Tet. Generally, if I'm living on some land for 3 years and nobody bothers me, nobody protests, then that is sufficient proof along with the claim. So listen, I bought it from you and you didn't protest. I don't have to have a deed. That is sufficient as proof that my claim is true. The Mishnah mentioned some exceptions and said, Ve'lo ish chazaka b'nichsei ishto. A man cannot make a chazakah on his wife's property, nor the other way around can a woman make a chazakah on her husband's property. That's because they live together and they generally have usage of their home and the properties that they each bring into the marriage, and they use them jointly. And therefore, let's say a wife has property that she owned from before the marriage. She brings into the marriage. The standard way that it works is that the husband can enjoy the produce while they are married, and in exchange, since he is enjoying the produce, he provides for his wife food, clothing, and shelter. That's a basic exchange. When the marriage is over, by divorce, or if he dies, then that land that she brought into the marriage goes back to her, depending on the type of land. Either she gets the actual land back or the value of the land back as assessed at the time of the ketubah. Now, since the husband has a perfect right to use the produce and to use the land all during that time, if he comes in the middle of marriage and says, "Oh, this is mine. My wife, you sold it to me. And my proof is, look, I've been consuming the produce for the past 3 years and you didn't say anything." She'll say, "I didn't say anything because we're married and you have a right to use it." It's kind of like a sharecropper. It's even stronger than a sharecropper, this relationship. And therefore, he cannot make a chazakah on her property, nor her if he owns property. And while they're married, she is consuming it. So she cannot come and say, "Hey, listen, I've been consuming this property for 3 years. You didn't say anything." The husband will say, "That's because you're my wife. I'm happy. I don't mind if you consume it. But that's not a proof that you bought it from me." So that's what the Mishnah says. So the Gemara says, this is so obvious. Why does the Mishnah even need to say it? Since in a case of when she brings property into the marriage, he has a right to the produce. That's the standard agreement. So of course he's enjoying the profits, and he's enjoying the profits because that's what they agreed to, not because he owns it. So obviously he cannot come and say, "Oh, you sold it to me. Where's the deed? I don't have a deed, but you didn't say anything for the past 3 years. So isn't that proof?" And we'll say, "No, that's not a proof. You're allowed to consume the produce. That was the deal. You consume the produce and you provide for your husband." So this is so obvious. Why does the Mishnah need to teach it to us? La siricha dechatavla dinu dvarim en li ben chasayich. Oh, the Mishnah only needs to say this to teach us a special case that we might have thought otherwise if we didn't know the Mishnah. We're talking about a case where the husband writes to his wife, "You know what? I want to have no legal dealings with your property." Even though she owns the property and he has a right to use it, he says, "Listen, I have lots of other property. I have income coming in, and I don't want to deal with your property. You keep it, you take the produce, and it's okay. I'll provide for you anyway from my other stuff." If he does that, since he wrote that he has no claim, no right to her property or the produce that it's consuming, I might have thought that if he consumes the produce anyway for 3 years and then says, "Well, you sold it to me," that maybe he would have a chazakah. Might have thought that because he relinquished his right. It's funny, this kind of guy, he looks like he's being nice by relinquishing his right to the produce of her property, but then he turns around and uses that very relinquishment as the basis of a chazakah. Says, "Well, you didn't protest, you didn't say anything." So I might have thought that this chazakah would be valid, and that's why the Mishnah comes to say, not so. Even though this husband relinquished his right to consume the produce of his wife's property, nevertheless, if he goes and consumes it, generally a wife is not going to protest. It's okay. She doesn't mind. He relinquished it. He was being nice. Now he's using it. I'll be nice. Hopefully, husbands and wives are nice to each other and they're generous with each other's stuff. And so that's why she didn't protest, because she's okay. She didn't mind him taking it. But that doesn't show that it belongs to him. This is different from a stranger comes and starts taking your produce. You better protest, right? Most people would protest. You wouldn't allow a stranger just to take all your stuff. But here, they are married, and that's why the Mishnah is coming to teach, yes, even in this case, the husband cannot claim a chazakah. Now we ask, V'chi katav la mai haveh v'hatanya ha'omer lechavero dinu dvarim en li al sadeh zo ve'en li isek ba ve'yadai misulakot mimena lo amar kilum. We just have a question on the reality of the case. Just because a husband wrote a document to his wife and says, "Listen, I relinquish any claims I have on your land." Of course, ownership of the land he never got, but even the produce. Does that work? Is that a legally binding document? Just because he wrote it, so what? We have a Batra that we've cited a couple of times before, that if someone owns some property and he goes to his friend, maybe they have shared property, and he says, "Listen, this property, I have no legal dealings with it. I want to have no involvement, no business with it. My hands are removed from it." Right? This is meaning you take it all. He has not said anything, and the difference is not whether it's oral or in writing. Whether it's oral or in writing, the property does not transfer to that other guy. In order to transfer property, you need to do an action. You have to do a kinyan, chalipin, or some other kind of kinyan that will show that the receiver actually received it. Just saying, "Oh, this, I have no dealings with this," that does not cause relinquishing of your property, and that the other person should have it. And therefore, even if the husband says, "I want to have no dealings with this property that you brought into the marriage," it won't change anything. The second that they get married, once they do the chuppah, so her property automatically transfers to him, and it's his. It's his. It's not his. It doesn't belong to him. He has the right to consume the property. She still is the owner, but he has control over the produce. He gets that automatically, and just writing or saying, "I don't want to have any dealings with it," doesn't transfer it over back to him. And therefore, this case would not be any different from him saying nothing at all. He owns the right to the produce, and therefore, obviously, he cannot make a chazakah. So this case is just as obvious as a case where he doesn't say anything at all. His saying something has no legal effect. And therefore, this is not a good case, because this is as obvious as a case where he didn't say anything. So obviously, he has a right to the produce. Certainly, he cannot make a chazakah. So even if he says, I don't want any right to it, his words are ineffective, and therefore his chazakah still would be certainly invalid, and that would be obvious. And the answer is from the scholars of the school of the Bianai. Our Mishnah is talking about a case where he wrote this statement, "I don't want to have any dealings with your property," before the chuppah, while they were still just nisu'ah. And nowadays, we do the kiddushin and the nisuin back to back, maybe just a 5-minute speech in between. But back then, they would do the kiddushin first. He gives her a ring and says, "Okay, you cannot marry anybody else." So she's exclusive to him. But at that point, they still aren't living together. And at that point, her property still remains her own. He only gets the property once they do the chuppah, which back then would have been several months later. So our Mishnah is talking about a case where they did kiddushin. She still has her own property. Then he says, "All right, listen, this property, I don't want to have any dealings with your property. I relinquish my right to the produce." Since he says it before he gets it, that is effective. You see, once you have something in your ownership, then just saying it's yours, that doesn't work. But if you don't own it yet, and you just will own it when something happens, but it's not yours yet, and you say, I don't want it to come into my property, that is effective. How do we know? Rav Kahana said that if there's an inheritance that's expected to be coming to a person from some other place, it doesn't have to be literally an inheritance. It could be any event that it's not yours yet, but when something happens, then it's expected that this property will become yours. One can make a condition, says, no, I don't want it to come into my property. And you don't have to do any action in order for it not to be transmitted. You can just make the declaration, say, I don't want that to happen. And we see another example, another rabbi who says, that agrees with this. It's like Rava also said, that if someone says, I don't want the enactment of the sages like this, Rava gave an example. If the rabbi has made an enactment for the benefit of someone, to give somebody something, and the person who is expected to receive it says, I don't want it, I know I have a right to it, but it's okay, I relinquish that right. If he says so, then that's a valid statement. Now, what was Rava talking about when he said, like this? He was in the middle of talking about some subject, so he said, like this subject, but we don't know what the context was, so we fill it in. So what was the context that he was talking about? It's what Rav Huna said, name of Rav, because he said that a woman can tell her husband, I don't want your sustenance, and I don't want my work to go to you. Generally, the agreement is, in a standard marriage, it's assumed in the ketubah that the husband has to provide for his wife sustenance, food, clothing, shelter, all her needs. Now, should she work outside the house, she has a job, all of her earnings, her wages, go to the husband, which is fair, right? He's taking care of all the household needs, including her own needs, and so she works. So the earnings go to the husband to run the household. However, if a woman says, listen, I know this, the rabbis made this for my benefit. She gets automatic food, clothing, and shelter no matter what. The husband has to take the shirt, if there's not enough money, he has to take the shirt off his back in order to provide for her. So this is a benefit for wives, and the rabbis made this to make sure that the husbands would be obligated on it. However, if a woman says, I relinquish that right. I want to go work and I have a good job and I can take care of myself. I want to keep all my earnings. And husband, thanks but no thanks. I don't need you to sustain me. If she relinquishes the right to what the rabbis gave her, then that is valid. So we see a number of examples, and this is true here as well. As long as the husband, before the chuppah, while they're just engaged, says, I know you have this property that you bring into the marriage. I don't want any part of it. I don't want the produce. If he says that before the chuppah, that statement, even without an action, is legally valid. And in that case, that's where we might have thought that he could claim a chazakah because he has no right to the produce. So maybe he could say, look, I'm here for 3 years. I bought it and you didn't say anything. That's why the Mishnah comes and teaches, not so. She didn't say anything because she doesn't mind. If her husband takes some of the produce that really belongs to her, she was okay with it. They're generous with each other, and therefore he cannot claim a chazakah. We next make an inference from the Mishnah and then challenge that very inference. Since the Mishnah said that a husband cannot make a chazakah by saying, oh, look, I consumed your property here to his wife for 3 years, you didn't say anything, so he cannot make claim a chazakah. So we infer a chazakah he cannot do. Ha de'aya, yes. But let's say the husband brings proof. He brings witnesses that his wife, or a document that his wife sold him this property. She had property from before the marriage. She brings the property into the marriage. While they're married, she owns it, but he gets to use take the produce. And then somewhere along the way, he produces a document or witnesses that says she sold him the property. So then that would be valid, right? Because the Mishnah only says a chazakah is invalid, but a proof would be valid. But we have a challenge to this. Tema nachat ruach asiti leba'ali. She should be able to say, I sold it under duress. What's the duress? I wanted to please my husband. I didn't want him to be angry. He said he wants to buy this property from me. So I know if I say no, he's going to get all upset. It's not going to be shalom bayit. So I said, okay, fine, so that he'll be happy. But I didn't really mean to sell it. And therefore, it would be an invalid sale. We're saying this even though we just concluded beforehand that if someone hangs someone else on a tree and says, sell me your property or else, He doesn't want to, but he'd rather sell it than get beat up. So he decides, you know what? Okay, I'll really sell it, and he has full intention to sell it. But in this case, the husband's not going to beat her up. She's just like, okay, let me make him happy, but she doesn't really mean it. And ironically, because the pressure is actually less on her, so she never is really convinced that she's giving over her property. So shouldn't she be able to say, this was under duress, I never really meant it, I was just saying it so he wouldn't get angry at me? And we have a proof that she could make such a claim. Mi lo tenan, lakach min ha'ish vechazav lakach min ha'isha, mikacho batel, alma amra nachat ruach asiti leba'ali, hachaname tema nachat ruach asiti leba'ali. Mishnah Gitin says that if a third party, buys property from the husband and then from the wife, right? Let's say that there's certain property that she brought into the marriage and that the husband is using, and there's an interested buyer out there. He wants to buy the land. So technically he has to deal with both of these parties, because the husband is controlling the land right now and has the right to the produce, but she is the actual owner and she'll get it back eventually. So he has to do two transactions. So this third party buyer, he pays money and buys it from the husband. Good. But now she also has claim to it. She's actually the primary owner. And so the third party goes and pays her some money also, so that he says, no, not only now, if he only buys from the husband, then the buyer can use the produce now during the marriage. But he wants to make sure that even after the marriage ends, then he keeps the land. So he has to go and pay some money to the wife and give it to her. Let's say he does both. So he satisfied both the husband and the wife. The sale is invalid. Why? Because she can say, listen, I didn't really want to sell my property. He went to the husband first. The husband agreed to it. Now I'm going to say no. If I say no, my husband's going to come yelling at me. So, oh, it was good money. We need the money. Why'd you say no? It's going to cause a fight. So I said yes, but I didn't really mean it. And therefore the sale is invalid. Just like in the case of a third party buyer, when even though she agreed, she said she would sell it, and went through with it, nevertheless, the sale is invalid. So too, when the husband himself buys it from her, also the sale is invalid. Because just like she doesn't want it to be sold to a third party, she doesn't want her property to be sold even to her husband. She wants it as her right, so that after divorce or after he dies, she keeps that property. She doesn't really want to sell it. So we see this is a valid claim on her part. So that's what we ask. How come this inference that says that the husband can claim a proof and says, I bought it from my wife, and that would be valid, but after all, can't she say that it was under duress? So we answer based on something that we said about this Mishnah. Ha'itmad Allah, Amar Rabba bar Rav Huna, lo nisrecha ela beotan shalosh sadot, achat shekatav la beketubata, v'achat sheyiched la beketubata, v'achat shechnisa lo shum mishelaha. When can she say it was under duress and I didn't want to sell that? That is only true regarding three specific fields. Number one, if they wrote in a document, this specific field is designated for payment of your marriage contract. In general, a woman has a lien on all of her husband's property. With everything he has now, we even write anything that he will take in the future. All right, so will definitely get paid. Now, even though she has a lien on all of his property, they would write in the ketubah, specifically field A over there, that I'm designating as the payment of your ketubah. Should he die or they get divorced, then she knows she'll take that property. If he wants to sell that property, then certainly she can say, no way, you're not selling that property. That's designated for my ketubah. And she would, even if she agrees and says, okay, fine, sell it, obviously she doesn't really mean it, and that sale is invalid. That's what the Mishnah applies to. It also applies to a property that is not written in the ketubah, but orally they made a stipulation in front of witnesses, and the husband says, listen, this here field, this will be for your ketubah. That also, even if he says, I want to buy it, and she says, okay, she can say that was under duress. This is my guarantee. so that sale is invalid. And also a land that she brought in of her own. The first two were examples of land that he owns, but that he designated to pay her ketubah. She can deny that and say, no, that was under duress. And land that she brought in, that's guaranteed property, meaning that it was assessed. That's the shum. It was assessed at the time of the marriage. This is worth $1 million. And so at the end of the marriage, he will have to give her $1 million, whether that land went up in value or down in value. Because she brought that in, she doesn't want him selling it, because she wants to make sure that that land is there so that he'll sell it or whatever, and she'll get paid. So these three examples, that's where she can claim duress. But other properties that are not one of these three, she cannot make such a claim, and therefore we have an answer. When we say that the husband can bring testimony, proof that his wife sold him a certain property, that will not be valid if it's one of these three examples. She could say that was under duress. But any other properties that she has, he can claim, look, I have witnesses that you sold it to me, and then that would be valid. Okay, so we have an answer to a question, but we just have to find what are those other examples. These three, what do they exclude? So is it to exclude other property that the husband owns, right? He designated here land, field A, field B. That's going to be for your ketubah. And now he has some other fields, field C, that is not specified in the ketubah, not specified orally, not something that she brought into the marriage, just some land that he owns. But she has a lien on it, because she has a lien on all of his property to pay the ketubah. If he goes and he sells that, so a third party goes and buys it, and that third party goes and buys it from him, and to make sure that she's okay with it also, I want you to give up your lien, right? Here, I'll give you something to give up your lien on this property so that it never gets taken. Is that the case? That's excluded from the Mishnah, right? Remember, the Mishnah said that if someone goes and buys from him and then from her, then it's invalid, because she says that's under duress. And then we just said that only applies to three types of property. Okay, so what type of property can she not say it's under duress and the sale is valid? Is it regarding something like this, a different property that he has that's not designated for ketubah? That doesn't make sense, because in that type of field, all the more so, it will lead to enmity if she says no, because he'll say to her, oh, are you have your eyes on divorce, or you're looking for me to die quickly? In other words, he has some field that he owns. Now, of course, she has a general lien on all his property, but he has already a designated here, land A, land B, that's for your ketubah. He wants to sell land C, and so he needs her cooperation, because although he belongs to him, she has a lien, so he sells it to some guy for $1 million. That guy wants to make sure there's a guarantee, so he goes to her and says, I want to buy your rights to it, the lien that you have, for $50,000. If she says no, then the husband's going to be really upset. He's trying to do business here. He has a good deal on the table, and she's saying no. Why are you saying no, wife? What, you think? Are you planning a divorce sometime soon? Are you going to poison my food? You hoping that I die soon so that you can get this property? Is that why you're saying that is that why you're trying to stop the sale? And he'll get very upset at her. So in that case, all the more so, she would say, okay, fine. Yeah, I give up my right to this. I give up my lien on it. She would say that under duress, because the husband would be even angry at this case. See, in the other case where this is a field that's designated for her, there it makes sense. She would say, no, this is land designated for me, and so she may very well say, no, I protest and I don't want the sale. And how angry can the husband be? If the husband is angry about that, where she really has a right, she wants to protect her future. This is designated for whenever that should happen. It doesn't mean she's expecting it to happen soon. She's looking down the road. So if even in that case, she's afraid that the husband will be angry, and she says okay, even though she doesn't mean it. All the more so in a case of just random property that he owns, that he wants to sell, and she says no, certainly he'll be angry. And the fact that he'll be angry means that it's under duress, and she can protest. So it can't be talking about other land that he owns either. Ela lema'ut nichse melog. Ha'amar amemar ish v'isha shemachru b'nichse melog lo asu ve'lo kilum. So the only thing left over that's excluded from the Mishnah must be land that is she brings in to into the marriage. That's called nichse melog. That means she gets the land as it is at the end of the marriage. Whether the land went up or down doesn't matter. She gets the land itself. She'll get the profit if it's worth more, or she'll accept the loss. So this is riskier than nichse son barzel, which we were talking about before, where she gets the assessed value. Whether it gets up or down, she gets the same amount. Here, she gets back the land itself, and however much it's valued at the end of the marriage. That's what we're talking. If maybe that's what we're talking about. Someone comes and wants to buy this type of land from them, and so he goes to the husband, asking, "Can I buy the right to the land? I'm only going to use the produce." He says, "Fine." And then he comes to her, and this is also not have to buy from you because you're actually the owner, and I want to buy it from you even after the end of the marriage. And she says, "Okay." That's the case where if she says okay, then it's a valid sale, because here there would not be enmity if she said no. She has every right to say no. She actually owns this very land, and she's going to get this very land back. So she could say no if she wants, and what? The husband can't have a claim against her. It's her land. So if she says yes, then it must be she really means it. It's not under duress. So maybe that's what we're talking about, and that would be the type of land where... So, too, if the husband says, I bought this land from you, and I have a document that proves it that this is so, that's where this would be true. So our inference from the Mishnah says the husband doesn't have a chazakah, but he can bring proof that he bought land. So what kind of land would that apply to? It would be a land like this, land that she brought in, that she was expecting to get back. And if he wants to buy it and she says yes, then that must be a valid sale. So is that we have an answer? That's good, right? This is what we're talking about. But this also has a problem because Amemar said that if a husband and wife sold this very type, nichse melog, they have done nothing. If a third party comes and buys the land from him and then also buys it from her, he has to buy from him the rights to the produce. He has to buy from her the actual ownership rights and the right to get it after the marriage. It's invalid, right? Because still, she could say it's under duress. So how are you going to solve this? And it's easy to solve. Ki itamar amemar heched ezabin ihu umit atya ihi umapeka ina mezabena ihi umeta ata ihu mapek betakanta drabanan ucht Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina damar Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina באושה התקינו האישה שמכרה בנכסי מלוג ומתה הבעל מוציא מיד הלקוחות. When Amemar said the statement that a husband and wife that sell this in nichse melog, it's an invalid sale, that was only if they sold it independently from each other. But if they both sold it, they both agreed, then it is a valid sale. So as we say here, in a case where, let's say he sells it independently, and then he dies, so she can go and take it from his hands because he only sold the rights to the produce. But now, once he dies, the marriage is finished, and so she is actually the owner, so she can come and take it. That's when Amemar says that if a husband by himself, this is not a husband and a wife, but if a husband or a wife sell it without the other's agreement and permission. So if only he sells it, she can get it back. Or similarly, if she sells her land to this guy and dies, then he can come and remove it. Even though actually she's the owner and she has the right to sell it, she can sell the future right to the property. Once the marriage is over, it goes to you. So technically she has a right to do that. However, the rabbis said as a takana that should not happen. As Rabbi Yosef bar Chanina explains, in Usha, the rabbis got together in that city in the north of Israel, and they made an enactment that if a wife should sell nichse melog, that technically she owns and would get back at the end of the marriage. But then if she dies, the husband can repossess it from the buyer. We consider the husband to be a prior buyer, right? Just like if you sell land to two people, the one that you sell it to first is the one that really gets it. The one that bought it second was an invalid buyer. So too, the rabbi said we consider the husband to be a buyer who has a right to the land before that seller. So you see that if either one sells it independently of the other, then the sale is invalid. But if both of them sell it to a third party, he goes and pays him and pays her, pays him for the rights to the produce, pays her for the actual ownership of the land, then that's valid. And she cannot claim, oh, this was under duress, because she could have easily said, no, this is my field, I own it, I'm going to get it back after the marriage. No, I don't want to sell it. And the husband would not get angry about that. He would have no right to be angry about it. It's totally hers. And so if she does sell it, it's a valid sale. So too, this is coming all the way back to our case. If she sells it to him, to her husband, also it's a valid sale, because she could say no and the husband wouldn't get angry. So if the husband has proof that she sold it to him, then that sale is valid and she cannot claim duress. That's the case of the inference from our Mishnah that although a husband cannot claim a chazakah, if he has proof that he bought it, then that's valid. It's not going to be valid in other types of fields, the other types that we discussed above, because in those types of fields, she can say it was under duress. I just wanted to make my husband happy. But in this case, if it's an nichse melog that she brings into the marriage and she agrees, then her agreement is a full agreement and the sale is valid. We'll see another interpretation of Ememad on the next page. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen v'amen.